Welcome back to today's video. Today is Saturday, August 31st, 2024. I apologize for not having uploaded over the past 2 days. I've had a very shaky move-in season, but finally here, senior year of college, really exciting stuff. And so I'm finally settled in, and you should expect a lot of content between now and November 5th. But today's video topic is not going to be about me. It's going to be about the 2024 presidential election, with Vice President Kamala Harris's candidacy seemingly energizing voter registration and the base that Kamala Harris needs the most to win in the 2024 election. Now, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution was not the first news media source to really report on this. This was a wave of data points that we had been seeing across battleground states that has now been more and more reported on. It's not necessarily something that has been the main headline of the press after we've seen Kamala Harris's first televised joint interview with Governor Tim Walz, the presidential debate just 10 days away. And so there's a lot that's up in the news media right now that really isn't covering some of these more interesting data points that genuinely could make an impact in this upcoming November election. And the big part of this is that voter registration in the aftermath of Joe Biden dropping out of the race is that voter registration amongst minority women in particular has gone up quite significantly. In specific, in Georgia, we've seen that black women have added 75% more registrations than the same period in 2020. And the reason why we use 2020 as this really ideal period for the Democratic Party is because this was the last time, of course, anybody was ever able to win a presidential election, but the last time Democrats had really had a unified front on the House, Senate, and presidency. It was the first Democratic trifecta since Obama's first election, and it was a really strong showing for Democrats, at least on the presidential showing, in that they had flipped Georgia for the first time since 1992 and flipped Arizona for the first time since 1996. And of course, these are things that are significant because they help build out a general narrative in the election. They build out a mandate. They build out the electoral prominence and presence of the Democratic Party in the 2020 election. And what we saw around the months of May, June, July, August was the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement, with protests widespread across the United States, a heightened focus on the intersection of race, ethnicity, and politics, a heightened focus on the meaning and impact of police brutality across the United States. It was a time frame in which we saw that minority voters in particular, and specifically black voters, were amongst the most energized groups in this election cycle in comparison, even dating back to elections in the 90s, 80s, 70s, 60s. This was an election like no other. And in fact, in 2020, the presidential election turnout was the highest we had seen across the nation in over 100 years, with the last election even rivaling it being before the Titanic sank in the year 1900. And yet this time, with Kamala Harris on the ticket, it looks like that voter registration is jumping up by a very significant amount. I mean, we are talking about 75% more registrations, a massive improvement in the state of Georgia. And the reason why this matters is because, again, as I was saying earlier on in this video, it's not something that is just new. This has been happening since Kamala Harris has taken the helm. We've only recently got the data points to really show us that in a number of these battleground states and in a number of these key groups that Kamala Harris needs to win and can win based on what the data is telling us, voter registration is surging. It tells us that right now we are looking at Democrats really inspiring a base not only to get out and vote, but to get out and get to register and vote, which is something that Democrats have really been trying to tackle for quite some time. And they did so effectively in 2020. They energized the youth electorate. They energized minority voters. They energized the American populace in this one concerted effort for Joe Biden and against Donald Trump. And although the election was close, it absolutely worked. He flipped Michigan from red to blue. He flipped Wisconsin from red to blue, and Pennsylvania and Nebraska second, and Georgia and Arizona, and he locked down battleground states the Democrats typically had some trouble in. Colorado, a state that Hillary Clinton won by 4.9%, Biden won it by 14 points in 2020. Minnesota, New Hampshire, states that Hillary Clinton won by 2 points or less, New Hampshire actually being the closest state of the 2016 election, Biden wins them by 7 points plus. And these things just don't happen by accident. This happens because Democrats have a unique appeal to minority voters, to women voters, and with Kamala Harris, there's an intersection of the two with someone at the top of the ticket. The Democrats, in a very masterful way, are not leaning into it in a way that we saw Secretary Hillary Clinton do, but are doing so effectively in terms of enthusiasm and engagements. And what we are finding is that voters are positively responding to it. Even non-voters are now becoming voters who are positively respond to it. And what we are seeing feels very reminiscent of what we saw in the 2022 midterm elections, when in the immediate aftermath of the Dobbs decision, what were the headlines that were the telling signs in the Dobbs decision aftermath is that women were registering at a much higher rate than ever before. Right before the Kansas abortion referendum in early August 2022, Women were turning out in droves to register to vote in a primary where the coinciding abortion referendum was on the ballot over 2 years ago today. What we saw in a number of these battleground states is that women registered at a higher rate. And in the first election, post Roe v. Wade overturning, Democrats had a phenomenal night in the Senate elections, winning Pennsylvania by 5, winning Georgia by 3, winning Arizona by 5, winning Nevada, despite the polls saying Republicans would win here, and narrowing down a number of key and crucial swing Senate races, right? Missouri was under 15 points. North Carolina was supposed to be 7 points based on the polls. It was 3. And the governor races, where abortion rights matters the most and is most directly impacted by who is elected here, Democrats actually even outperformed their 2018 numbers in 2022, despite the national environment voting 11 points to the right of the 2018 national popular vote, to put things into perspective. And a big reason for this is because the gender divide became so apparent, but was largely driven by women who were turning out to vote for Democrats. And now we're seeing that, especially in the states where there is an abortion referendum on the ballot. And the reason why that matters is because we are looking at states like Arizona, where there's an abortion referendum on the ballot this November. States like Montana, where there is an abortion referendum on the ballot this November. Montana's not competitive on the presidential level, but certainly has a competitive Senate race here. But the point being that Democrats are driving up voters. They're winning on the strategy point of ballot initiatives that include issues like abortion, pro-choice, pro-life ideology, because it turns out the one base, the half of the country that is truly only impacted by abortion in a personal sense. The truest thing that we know and we have seen is that the Democratic base has been most inspired as of late by Kamala Harris's candidacy. And prior to that, was inspired by the Dobbs v. Jackson decision that stripped the right to choose away from millions of Americans nationwide. And so now we are starting to see the direct impact of that electorally, because there are electoral repercussions for any and everything in this nation. And Republicans are really about to learn, in the way that Democrats saw it happen in 2022, that saved them in an election year where they were running with an unpopular president at the helm of the ticket. Joe Biden in 2022 had an approval rating on election day down double digits, and yet, Democrats saw better performances in the nationalized Senate and gubernatorial races, and even some of those House elections. In comparison to 2020, they did even better. And these things only happen because Democrats turned out their base, Republicans were less inspired to vote, and Democrats swayed a very reliable vote base that Republicans used to win in the Romney era, in the McCain era, that in the Trump and post-Dobbs era had become more and more Democratic. And that is the suburban parts of the nation that have shifted quite tremendously in favor of the Democrats. And so when I see data points like what we're seeing from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution saying that the presidential race is shaking up sharp increases in voter registration amongst Latino women, amongst Black women, amongst Asian American women, you are talking about a group and a voting base that Democrats win consistently. The only racial group that Democrats lose in a presidential election, no matter what the state is, it is white voters. And in a state like Georgia, that was so incredibly narrow in the last election, any type of movement in favor of the Democratic Party or increased vote share is something that Democrats need, because their margin of victory here was less than a point. Now they're trying to expand it. And you can see it even too. In the areas in which you are seeing the voter registration increase, you're talking the Atlanta metro area, but not just there. You're talking about areas like Savannah, Georgia. You are talking about areas like Athens, where the University of Georgia runs through, right? You're talking about regions of the state that Democrats need for high turnout, and they're getting it. Not only the high turnout, but they're turning out voters, again, non-voters, into voters, and that is the most impactful. Because it's voting bases that Republicans don't have data points on, don't have things to look at to get them out to vote. And it is a voting base that Democrats routinely win. Specific to this journal article, Atlanta Journal-Constitution article for Georgia, just alone, Black women are the most reliable Democratic voting base in the entire nation. You are talking consistently 95-5 voting power for Democrat to Republican in terms of overall margin. That is massive for the Democratic Party. And again, an election as close as 2020, and I can tell you 2024 might even be closer. Every single vote matters. Every single voter registration point matters. Every single thing matters. And Kamala Harris's candidacy, whether in a battleground state or not, in a state with an abortion referendum or not, Democratic women, and women in general, are more inspired to turn out and vote. And what we know, too, is that Democrats win amongst female voters. Republicans win amongst male voters. And if it comes down to a specific issue, of enthusiasm, excitement, and stake in the election, there is a reasonable argument that has been drawn by many political analysts across this nation that if Democrats are to win in 2024, it is because women turned out to vote in the same way they did in 2022 in the aftermath of the Dobbs v. Jackson decision. Because the gender gap is also becoming more apparent. But it is women who vote at the higher rates. It is women that are more populous in the swing states and across the nation. It is data point after data point saying that women are more civically and politically engaged in the country. And so when you take a look at some of these states where the data points are suggesting that it is beyond even Georgia, it is these other battleground states that Kamala Harris is really starting to do quite well. It is a really good sign for the Democratic electorate, and it is a really good sign for Kamala Harris's candidacy in 2024. Because we are seeing this in the states that truly matter the most. And when you're talking about an election forecast as to who's going to win, a lot of what we're seeing here too is just on the base fact of who is currently a registered voter and what they are expected to do. When you see new people getting registered to vote and new voters that have never been in VAN or any type of voting system that Republicans and Democrats use to track electorates and turn out the base, Democrats are getting in new people. And not to say that, this is something that campaigns haven't faced for before. Millions upon millions of new people register in elections before a presidential race. But to see it being even outpacing the 2020 presidential election, which has largely been heralded as one of the Democratic Party's finest turnout efforts, because it was the highest presidential election turnout we have seen since 1900 flat. I mean, I'm not talking about the 20th century. I am talking about the year 1900. Before any of the world wars, before women had the right to vote, we saw higher voter turnout. We are talking about an election that was so incredibly high in turnout that it has only been rivaled, 2020 being that election, once in the past, 130 years, and it was in the year 1900. And so when we see 2024, for one, I will say, I do not believe turnout will be higher than it was in 2020. But it is a sense of enthusiasm and engagement, and especially when we see those data points about how a third of all of these, $580 million the Democrats raised in 2024, with Kamala Harris's candidacy in just a month and a half. $580 million. A third of all those donations came from first-time donors in this cycle, meaning that these are people who are now engaged. They might have donated in 2020, but they are re-engaging in 2024, and they didn't in the entirety of 2023. Biden announced he was running for re-election over a year ago, right? You are talking about a time frame in which Democrats have been scheming and plotting a bid for re-election because that's how this works. So has the Trump campaign, right? But Trump announced before Joe Biden. And so we've been in this Biden-Trump matchup for a year and a half before Biden drops out of the race. And what comes of it? After Kamala Harris assumes the power of the Democratic nomination and comes into this with a lot of electoral strength and support from the Democratic base. Again, a third of the $580 million, those donors come from first-time donors in this election cycle. So even in knowing it was a Biden versus Trump rematch, they weren't all in for Biden, but they are all in for Harris, and that matters. And so that's where I think we're really starting to see these levels of enthusiasm really make a difference. Because while Kamala Harris undoubtedly is in a close and competitive race, it is that level of enthusiasm that puts Democrats over the finish line because it has done so in the past election. In 2022, Democrats would not have the governorship had not voters turned out in Wisconsin and had been inspired to vote for Tony Evers. But even more importantly, a state like Arizona, where a draconian pre-Civil War, pre-Arizona state's founding abortion law that came into play from the 1800s was enforced by the Arizona Supreme Court. The governor, Katie Hobbs, and the attorney general in that state, both Democrats, won their races by less than a point, said, we are not upholding this law. We will not prosecute. We will not criminally charge. We will not go after doctors. We will not go after women across this nation. Across the state. And that showed the direct impact of how just a few thousand votes can make all the difference in abortion policy, can make all the difference in a woman's right to choose. So many different ways to really slice that and take it away. Point being, though, this was the direct impact of high voter turnout amongst women and a changing Republican suburban electorate that used to be locked down. Romney won the state by 9, so did McCain, locked down GOP electorate that now has turned on the Republican Party. And so overall, what I think we can take away and really come to learn from this voter registration tidbit is that this is not something that you really see in the mainstream media and the mainstream press, and I honestly think there's a reason for that. It's really hard to gauge what this means when it comes down to just increased voter registration, because if they don't turn out to vote, it really doesn't matter. But we can read between the lines, and we can cover things that some of the mainstream media really doesn't like to touch. Obviously, this is not the most prevalent or prominent issue of right now, but it is something that matters electorally, and I'm glad we get to talk about it. When you're looking at the battleground states, especially if Kamala Harris, should she win the states by just narrow amounts like Joe Biden did in 2020, but this time in 2024, you'll know it comes from this heightened voter registration, from this excitement, from this enthusiasm that we didn't see exhibited under the Biden-Harris campaign, that we are seeing in full force under the Harris-Walz campaign. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the top left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 presidential election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.